Okay. So Egypt is known as not the land between the two rivers. I copied that from my previous one. And this is the gift of the Nile, what that was supposed to say. Because if it weren't for the Nile River, Egypt would not exist. It's completely surrounded by desert. And this is significant in a lot of ways because Egypt is protected, that's my pointer, by desert on the east and on the west, the sea on the north. Only a couple times in its period is it actually invaded by sea. The sea peoples are what comes to mind. Sinai Peninsula is pretty hard to cross, etc. So Egypt isolated, whereas Mesopotamia is right by the Iranian highlands and Anatolia, what we now call Turkey, is constantly being invaded. And this is part of the reason why its culture remains so static. Okay, its religious system and its society stays incredibly constant. Even during the late period when it's occupied, I mean, it's a very interesting thing. We had, I'm trying to think who just gave, well, Dr. Blumel gave a lecture last week. He was talking about even during the Christian period, the Coptic period, there's still a lot of pharaonic culture that was kind of lingering. Really love spells and this kind of stuff we talked about. Now, here are the periods of Egypt. So we have the Archaic period, which, this is ancient Egyptian language, and you don't need to know this. I don't know, I got excited, I told this from 201. This is probably exciting only to Jolyn. We have early Egyptian, which is the Archaic,
Egyptian too.
Old Egyptian. The middle period is Classical. The later periods are for the New Kingdom. Demotic is written in a different script, and we'll talk about this when we look at the Rosetta Stone in the British Library. It's Egyptian being written in a cursive script, which is easier to write than hieroglyphics. And Coptic is a Greek-based alphabet for Egyptian, late Egyptian, and that's a Christian language. And 10% of the Egyptians today are still Copts. A lot of people don't know this. When you consider that Egypt's about 50 million people, or 70 million even now, and 10% of them are Christian. It's kind of amazing that there are 5 to 7 million Christians in Egypt. We always think of that part of the world as being all Muslim. Okay, you didn't know that. Sorry, I got a little excited. Now, one of the things you'll see depicted a lot in Egyptian art is the papyrus bush. And that's because it's a reed that grows on the banks of the Nile. Of course, this is what they make paper out of. So we'll see documents written on papyrus. But you'll also see this motif in some of the art. That is what papyrus paper looks like. So they take the stalks, and they beat them, and they make that kind of paper out of it. Ostraka is a term you'll see. I didn't put it on your review sheet. You don't have to reproduce it for me. But this is pieces of broken pottery that they use to write on. Remember we talked last time about cuneiform and how baked clay tablets were a very durable material. Once you've made a pot, it might break. You might drop it and it will break, but the pieces themselves never dissolve or turn back into mud. And so we have a lot of writing on Ostraka. Okay. You don't need to know all the different kinds of scripts, but here we have the famous Rosetta Stone that we'll see in the British Museum. Egyptian was undeciphered for a long time until a fellow named Jean-Francois Champollion actually deciphered it. And that's because this is a stone from the late period, from the Ptolemaic period. And it had hieroglyphics, and then Demotic, which is a different Egyptian script, and Greek. And we could read Greek, and so working backwards, they could figure out Demotic, and then from Demotic they could figure out hieroglyphic. But it was until that time they didn't know whether it was symbolic or phonetic, and now they know that it's actually both. Okay. Hieratic is the form of hieroglyphic. Hieroglyphic means sacred shapes. Glyph is a shape. So this was primarily the province of the priests. The scribes were almost always priests. And this is the kind of stuff that you usually see. You can see much better than you can with cuneiform how it started out as shapes. Okay. Demotic, as I said, is a cursive script based on hieroglyphic, but it actually has an alphabetic table. Can you do any Demotic?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay. And then Coptic, for those of you who do Greek, you'll recognize most of these letters. There are a couple unique letters for Egyptian sounds that Greek doesn't have, like sh, okay, f. Well, I guess we have a phi in Greek. A lot of consonant clusters, z, ch, and this kind of thing. Okay. In terms of what's written on papyrus and on carvings and on Ostraka, lots and lots of funerary text. And in fact, some of them start as early as the Old Kingdom. The pyramids are simply the most obvious or monumental displays of their preoccupation with death and the afterlife. And so written in the pyramids were all these texts explaining how Pharaoh was becoming Osiris and the journey, etc. Now, the Book of Breathings wasn't in your reading for this particular class, but the Book of Breathings was kind of a handbook for not just royalty, but anyone who died, and how they would pass the guardians and go through gates and eventually get to a happy place in heaven. Years ago, Hugh Nibley, if you know that name, analyzed a version of the Book of Breathings and compared it to the Joseph Smith Papyri, which we used to think was where the Book of Abraham came from. We now know that the Papyri is kind of a catalyst for the prophet. The Book of Abraham's revelation more than translation. But Hugh Nibley published this really kind of provocative book called The Book of Breathings, an Egyptian Endowment. Now, the Book of the Dead is significant because we will see this. Okay, so we have some examples of the Book of the Dead in the British Museum. And this is from a slightly later period. It's a collection of, I think, 200 different... Who was the charms master in Harry Potter?
Flitwick.
Yeah. Okay, so these are spells, but they're kind of like charms, actually. So for you Harry Potters, I'm just throwing you a bone there. Keep you interested. But anyway, these were these blessings that you basically said for your dead person, so they can negotiate the afterlife. We have epistles and letters. You're not going to deal with them in this class, but 201, remember we talked about the Amarna-Cash. Okay, this was diplomatic correspondence, hymns and poems, etc. For you A&ES majors, particularly the Hebrew Bible people, the Greek New Testament people should know this as well. Wisdom literature, so like Proverbs, Song of Solomon, actually has parallels in Egyptian wisdom literature. So all of this stuff is of a piece. And of course the pharaohs are always writing on the walls, "I'm great." Ramses is particularly prone to do this. And you know this from both Ten Commandments and Prince of Egypt, that Ramses was really kind of full of himself. Okay, so here are the periods, and I highlighted the ones that you really need to know. Particularly, it's the Old and New Kingdom. I didn't even give you the chapter on the Middle Kingdom from your Bible reader's history. I mean, it's there, and if you want to read it, that's great. But I want you to be aware of the Middle Kingdom. You'll see some objects in the museums labeled Middle Kingdom, as the classical period of literature, but since we're looking primarily at artifacts and not text, there's just not as much of that we're going to see. So Old Kingdom pyramids, New Kingdom famous kings. If you can remember that, you'll be good. Now, in terms of the evolution of Egyptian funerary practices, we start out just burying people in holes, okay? Now, it's interesting because we'll actually see this dude. He's in the British Museum. But one of the earliest surviving bodies was not in a fancy temple or a pyramid. He was just in a pit. Okay, what's he called? The copper man? What's his name? The suntan man or whatever?
Yeah, on his side.
Yeah, so it's because they used to put them in a fetal position like they were sleeping. But because of the dry sand, you don't have to do the whole, you thought I was going to ask you the mummification process. You thought I was going to ask you natron and canopic jars, didn't you? But anyway, you don't have to do all of that to mummify somebody. You just have to bury them in the hot sand and they'll dry out. You can also do this in ice. There's a very famous mummy from Switzerland from the Ice Age, and there's some in the Inca Mountains, because the Andes Mountains are both dry and cold. So it's kind of a freeze-dry effect, okay? So kind of like a meal ready to eat, but as a person. Okay, so you have a prehistoric pit grave. Then they start making these kind of tombs, they're like mausoleums. If you ever go to a fancy cemetery, not in Utah as much, but in the East or in California, you'll have these above ground mausoleums. That's kind of what a mastaba is. Now, the pyramids start, the original capital of Egypt was on the border between Upper and Lower Egypt. So Memphis, when Menes supposedly unified the kingdom, that was a good place to rule. So across from Memphis, in the desert, you don't build funerary chapels, mausoleums, and pyramids on good agricultural land. You need that to grow food. So you put them out in the desert. Originally, the pyramids were stepped. You have a square, you put a smaller square, still smaller square, etc. Until we finally get to the famous pyramids, which in antiquity were smooth. Okay, it's because they had limestone that was put in the gaps, and that was taken by later periods. In fact, this is something we will mention now. Most ancient monuments are ruins for 2 or 3 reasons. 1, wars and destructions, that happens. 2, lack of upkeep. You don't take care of things, they fall down. But 3, and probably the reason most ancient monuments are in ruins, is because later people cannibalized them. So, for instance, the Roman Forum and the Colosseum are both the shape they're in, because in the Renaissance, the popes and the other rulers of Rome didn't want to have to go quarry new stone. So they just went the Forum and the Colosseum, just took it. Okay. In Athens, in Greece, all of Greece, not just Athens, the real problem was lead was valuable. And the pieces of stone, particularly the columns, were kept together with little pieces of lead. And so they would sneak in the night, they'd hammer holes in the columns, pull out the lead, because that was valuable. And without the lead to hold the pieces together, they fell down. That's what, I don't know if you've heard the expression, get the lead out, to hurry up. We think it comes from that because they were in such a hurry to steal the lead before they were caught. Anyway, so that's what happened to those pyramids. Now, skipping the Middle Kingdom, sorry, Jolynn, and going right to the New Kingdom, this is the period of the great kings who ruled not only Egypt, but they expanded to the south of what we call the Sudan. And you'll see a lot of monuments and artifacts labeled Kush. Okay, so Kush was the kingdom to the south, and they expanded into what we call Palestine and Lebanon and Syria today. Okay, so this is when Egypt reached its greatest extent. This is when you have your famous pharaohs, most of whom you already know from both the reading and from our reading quiz. So here's Sister Hatshepsut. Someone who does Egyptian, help me pronounce that correctly.
Hatshepsut.
You say shoot?
Yeah.
Hatshepsut. This is her famous temple. Here she kind of looks like a woman, but we do have her with the beard on her. So she became regent for her stepson, nephew, and son-in-law. Well, the reason they marry their sisters and brothers is because they're trying to keep the divinity in the family, so to speak. There used to be a theory that you actually couldn't be pharaoh unless you were married to someone from the line, which is what Ten Commandments actually has. That woman is someone needs to be king. We don't think that's the case. We think it's just trying to keep it all in the family, so to speak. Anyway, so we'll see lots of monuments, statues of her. When she died, her stepson, this is a Latin word, I don't think anyone here does Latin, it's Greek and Hebrew and stuff. But Latin, but not to memorialize, I used to be a Roman historian in a previous life before I started teaching ancient scripture. It means wiping out the memory. The Roman emperors did it all the time, but so did the Egyptian kings. If you didn't like your predecessor, you scratched their names off of every monument. You oftentimes broke the statues, or you put your head on top of their statues and just reuse it. That's the Ten Commandments. Again, maybe we'll have to watch Ten Commandments at some point. When they send Moses, when they send Moses away in exile, or they say, let the name Moses not be said, may be stricken from all the monuments, that's actually, they had good collaborators in those days, kind of expert advisors on those kind of films. Now here's Akhenaten, and here he is with his wife Nefertiti and their ugly children. Okay, like I said, this is really, this is Nefertiti, and she's actually very famous because of that particular statue, actually. But it's the carvings and the paintings where they just look weird, just really weird. So that's what I mean when I talk about them being caricatures, if you will. Artistic liberty and realism, I should say infamous depictions of Akhenaten and his wife and their daughters. This guy was a religious fanatic. The sun is almost always portrayed in the middle of a carving or a painting, and the rays of the sun have little hands on them, reaching down and blessing people. Okay, here's our friend, Ramses is God. I put that one in there so you can see how big it is. Okay, so these are absolutely... This one is. We're not going to see this one. Yeah, we're not going to see any of this. Okay, we're not going to Egypt. But this is in Karnak and Abu Simbel, which is now Aswan. Have you been to Egypt? Okay.
And Israel. So I've seen.
Yeah. So that's
really big.
That's really, 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 really big. Okay. So that's just to give you a taste. I'm a little bit behind on the artifact list, which is fine because most of that's going to be for ANS 363. I will have details on how that class is going to be run, but every week my ideas evolve on this. It's a spring class, and I realize there's no reason when we're so busy in Europe for you to be writing site reports or museum reports. So since the class runs all of spring, what I'm going to do is set it up so you can write your short 3 to 5 page reports before you go, okay? And so I'm gonna get this artifact list and all of the readings up so that if you find an object you wanna do, there'll be some readings online you can do, do a lot of extra research. And so my thinking is, if we can get all of the academic stuff done in May, and then all we'll need to do when we're actually in Europe is we will have checklist of artifacts you need to see and say that you found them. Okay, so that way, I mean, I'm gonna take my laptop because I can't live without my computer, but if you don't wanna take your tablet, your laptop, it won't be as vital because you won't be writing papers, which is what I thought you were initially going to do. So these ideas are still developing. But remember, it is a 3-credit class, the fieldwork class. So does that sound good to everyone, that you'll have May to write your short reports, and then we'll be in the field 3 weeks together. That's only bad for 2 of us who are traveling most of May, but you don't have to organize your life, Rachel. Okay, good. Click that off, and we're gonna shift gears.